Tulio Sirgus, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Carlos and Kim, who are chiming in from Mexico City and Hermosillo. And we have today our guest, Sean Massa, who's going to talk to us about some recruiting. We're going to talk about recruiting today, and that should be an interesting topic of conversation considering everything that's going on right now. Welcome to the show, Sean. If you could kindly introduce yourself to the audience, tell us who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Sean Massa. I've been working in some form as a software engineer for like a dozen years. Who remembers anymore? And I've seen a lot of interesting things in terms of the tech, but I've been focusing more recently on more the social aspects of working in software and trying to make sure that the way that we work as software company is more efficient, and the way that we treat not just candidates that we're hiring, but employees that we have fairly and reward people properly. It's all sort of mixed together into various aspects of things that I've been caring about more recently.
Sean, so where are you based? You're in Chicago, I think, right?
Yep, I'm in a suburb of Chicago.
Great. And did you grow up there, or is that where you sort of landed after school?
It was, I grew up a couple hours south in Champaign, and it was more just a job opportunity thing. And I met my now wife, but girlfriend at the time in college, and they lived in Chicago. So it just made a lot of sense to move up there.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your business. What gave birth to this idea? Flash recruiting, correct?
Yeah, Flash Recruit. Yeah, we're a job board. Yeah, we're a job board that focuses a lot on making that connection between the candidate and the recruiter, and do that in a now traditional way in the e-commerce side, but recruiting software usually takes a little bit of time to catch up to what's going on in e-commerce. And we do that through chat. So as a candidate, you can jump on and actually start chatting with the recruiter for a job before you even apply. Maybe you just had a simple question. A common case is something like, the job description mentions there's some travel, but not quite how much, and I want to get a better feel for how much that is. I can just ask the recruiter like how much travel's involved in this. They say it's not really that much, ebbs and flows, it's like average of 20% or whatever. And you say, okay, that's fine, I'll actually go through and apply, or maybe you don't. But you can use it as a screening tool or just extra information, or after you've applied, continue to communicate with that recruiter. It's all just part of that process. And then you can, it's a way of capturing that part of the funnel that usually job boards miss, where you just see that apply button. And as a candidate, I imagine most people have had a similar experience. You know that you're going to fill out some giant form and no one's ever going to read it or get back to you about it. And it just feels like a black hole where you wasted a bunch of time. So part of our solution is trying to capture some of that and get some of those people who would be qualified into that funnel.
Cool. Kim, what's the topic of conversation today? Let's go right into it.
Yeah. The topic of conversation, the title of today's talk is Strength Finding Interviews. And basically, Sean's here to tell us how to highlight candidates at their best to reduce bias and gatekeeping in hiring. I think Flash Recruit itself, hearing what you had to say, Sean, is interesting to me. I like the idea of beginning to build a relationship with candidates and recruiters from the very start. I think that's really beautiful, and basically streamlining it, right? Which is better for candidates and better for the recruiting team as well. But going into your tagline, the first thing I guess I want to talk about is two terms that you chose to use, and that is bias and gatekeeping. So could you please define those for us and tell us basically what they are and why it's important to know this and recognize them?
Yeah, I use those terms deliberately, as you may imagine. They're both basically bias, like everything's bias when you get down to it. But the gatekeeping one is sort of personal to me. Like me getting interested in any of this really came from going through interview processes and running interview processes on the other side, and seeing a lot of people trying to add requirements that they think mean something, which do, but they also exclude a lot of people, like requiring that you have a college degree to be a software engineer or something like that. Like maybe that means something, it's debatable. but maybe it does. But even if it does, you're still excluding a bunch of other great people who don't have that thing. And that's sort of the gatekeeping aspect. But in general, bias, it's all about bias, right? It's trying to make sure that we aren't letting those unconscious things that are in our brains that help us make those snap judgments affect our decision making in some negative way. And it's going to be like a lifelong struggle for anyone who cares to address something like this. Like, no one's ever going to be removing bias entirely from their own lives. But at least when you try to make an effort, you can identify some things. And for me, the main way to combat bias is to putting structure in place that doesn't depend on a human. So part of a process, whether it's software or manual, but that's what those mean to me.
Okay, so it's an interesting thing. I have a question, and I'd love to get your extra opinion on this. I think that a lot of recruiting efforts aren't, and correct me if I'm wrong, aren't very flexible with the times, right? Mm-hmm. Gatekeeping was probably more relevant back in the day when there were a lot more candidates than there were openings. So you're trying to, basically swift out those that are not the right fit, because you might have 10x the amount of application than normal, right? Let's go back to 2008, 2009. Perhaps some of that even might apply depending on how things play out in the next few weeks or months right now. But go back last year when the markets are doing well, some companies are still using those same practices when in reality they're struggling to find candidates. So how does this help kind of make it more dynamic and flexible for employers or recruiters to get smart about when to have more filters and when not to, in order to effectively accomplish what they need to do based on the times and the events that are happening? What's your experience been like there?
That's a really important point. Like this, what we're talking about today is not going to be some silver bullet that fixes everything for everyone. Like those solutions are rare, and this isn't one of them. The important distinction is volume. Like it always comes down to volume. If you're getting 100 applications a day for your one job, like you have to filter that down somehow. Like there's no reasonable way you're going to spend a deep amount of time on every single one of those. So I get it, like filters are important. But even when you need to use filters, you should be more mindful about what they actually are. And it just can't be something as easy as you have a college degree, for example. For a lot of roles, some roles it's absolutely required. But if you aren't in that position, like the farther away you get from having massive, massive volume, that's where I think more of these techniques apply, where you spend a little bit more time on the interview process and with each candidate, trying to figure out, could they be a good fit, assessing them in some consistent way, and all the other parts of the process. So yeah, it's about volume and filters for sure.
Do you have techniques for determining what good filters are?
I mean, that's the hard part. The job board industry specifically has like some standard data. It's like when you see a job on a job board, that probably exists on 100 job boards. It just depends on how it gets broadcasted. And what ends up as like actual structured data that you can easily filter on across all of those is whatever the subset is of all those things that they support, which is usually like a title, a big blobby description, maybe some free text separate description of requirements, maybe compensation information if you're lucky. Like it gets whittled down. And the same is true on the candidate side. So like one source might have like a giant form that requires all kinds of data from a candidate, but then you're going to have more drop off from candidates filling that out. So it's hard to get candidate data too. So it's hard to get enough relevant different data to match the two directly with some algorithm. And so it does require a human to read through, like on the job description side, reading through that and trying to parse out some information, but also on the candidate side, looking through any public professional links that they might share. I try not to dig into someone's Facebook or anything, but if they have a LinkedIn profile, like that's fair game. So it's a little bit more human, a little bit more heuristics, but it's definitely things like what are typically called soft skills. I don't like that term, but if someone has a better term for it, by all means, let me know. But those things, looking for people that describe job responsibilities that they've had, where it's more about managing a project or communicating on a team or doing something else that's very, very valuable. That's not necessarily the like explicit skill you're hiring for. Those are the types of other filters I'm looking for.
So we're talking today a little bit about your strength finding. I would think that, you know, part of sifting through and narrowing down the right people is identifying strengths that are the right fit. How do you go about doing that? How does your platform facilitate that? And obviously that's different for different industries and different roles. So how deep or how wide does it go in terms of supporting me as an employer or a recruiter in using that as a way to identify the best fit candidate for a role?
Yeah, there's the strength finding aspect really comes in after someone's applied and you've decided, like they've already passed your filters. It doesn't apply as much to determining the filters and executing on them. That's still a hard thing to do. You should still, like I said, try to do that a little bit better. But after they've actually come through and applied and you've decided some notion you at least want to phone screen them, for example, that's when the strength finding starts to apply. And it's much more about the interview process itself.
Sean, I got a question for you. And this is, I know that this conversation is mostly around strength finding and candidates. But my question is about the Flash Recruit specifically, because I'm intrigued about whatever, okay, let me rephrase this. There might be folks out there watching this that are outside of the US. So I would assume that there might be challenges or differences in applying the principles with which you built the tool when you're focused on finding strengths or reducing bias. You know, how do you deal with those geographic considerations if someone is interested in using Flash Recruit from abroad, or how do you handle those situations from one country to another, from geography to another, from one culture to another? Have you seen that happen with Flash Recruit? Yeah,
I do want to make the distinction, like Flash Recruit, we are a job board and we facilitate hiring, and strength finding interviews is a strategy that I personally use to hire people at the company Flash Recruit. The Flash Recruit site does not facilitate strength finding interviews necessarily, although that's an interesting path to explore in the future. But yeah, the part of strength finding includes like cross-cultural boundaries, definitely. Like we had some people apply from South America, from European countries, Canada, Mexico, I said that, but a couple different places throughout the world. And sometimes there were cultural differences that we needed to figure out, which I'm very excited to try and figure out how's the best way to approach that. And it's difficult for me because my cultural background is the stereotypical, like common thing that I don't encounter the problems on the other end. So it's a little bit harder to figure out what to even account for. But I do have an example. So one candidate we had, from my perspective, had like a very different English accent than what I'm used to hearing. So it's a little bit hard for us both to actually understand each other a little bit. And that's not a reason to not hire someone. It's just another opportunity for addressing like how can we communicate, because communication is still an important part of working together. So we talked about it explicitly, just open, like this is a thing that we'll probably have to figure out. And we found some great compromises. Like apparently I was talking a little too quickly for them, so I tried to make sure I was being a little bit more deliberate in my speech. And they were trying to enunciate certain sounds a little bit more directly, help with what I was used to. And we worked through it. We got past it and we continued the interview process. And I think as hard as those things can be to talk about and to try to be, make sure you're not saying the wrong things because of some cultural context you don't have, we still have to try to do those things and we'll work past them. So this is part of that. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So thank you, Sean.
So Sean, you said something interesting. So this is proprietary to your company. If an employer wants to take advantage of this, they basically work with your company. Have you thought about licensing this as a platform, as a solution? How does it compare to what's out there? I'm curious to understand
strength finding
Yeah.
You mean strength finding interviews specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there's different tests and methodology to try to understand different personalities and strengths, and and such, DISC assessments and such. How is this different from those kinds of solutions that are out there? What is it? What is it about what you guys do that's uniquely different? Curious to highlight that.
Sure. In general, about proprietary versus licensing, I'm interested in just sharing the information so that people can use this technique or not if they want to, not necessarily trying to sell it. Maybe eventually we make a tool to help facilitate taking the strategy and we can make some money off of that. But that's not the point. The point is I've found this to be a much more effective way to hire people. And I think it would be useful for some other people, especially in not extreme volume jobs, to take advantage of. As far as the other part of your question, I think that the key difference really is how you go about structuring the interview. Like the strength finding aspect of this is when we go to interview somebody, we are asking them, we basically negotiate the interview format. The flow, just briefly, is I will send them an email that describes all the pieces of the interview process and which piece we're currently on, which is negotiating the interview format. And we'll list out a bunch of the needs of the company or the team that they'd be joining. And the expected response from them is, I give them some examples so they know what kind of things we're looking for, but a list of their strengths that overlap with the needs of the company. And it can be somewhat more generic, like someone's good at just working in the database, or much more specific, someone's really good at writing chat software because they've done that at a couple different jobs before, and that's what we need experience with too. And once we get that overlap, then we decide on a format. Okay, we're going to assess this skill, that skill, whatever. Does that sound good to you? Someone might come back and say they'd really like to also highlight some other skill that they have that they think would be useful to us. And then we build up the interview in that way. And that's the difference in the strategy between this and a more traditional interview format, where it might be much more rigid. It might just be, this is the interview that all of our software engineers go through, for example.
So if I heard this correctly, it's a lot more customized, and the interviewee participates in how it's structured.
Yeah.
Which I think is very important, because some people don't do well, for example, in tests, right? Even in our own recruiting effort, you could have a brilliant engineer who just, you put a test in front of them and they don't do very well in that, in an interview process. So now you're basically eliminating the prospect of a really great person and candidate because a test said that they didn't do very well.
Exactly.
And I'm one of those people, you put a test in front of me, I'm not going to do very well. So it's just, some people just operate differently in how they communicate and how they connect with you and how they highlight what they can do. So I really like this idea of agreeing to what the interview is going to look like and having the candidate participate in that. I've actually never heard of that. Any of you guys ever heard that? I mean, I think that's brilliant, and I'd love to hear some more on some examples of where that worked and how companies could kind of adopt that based on what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, we really like the format. It's turned out really well for us so far. I can give like a positive example and a negative example to help highlight where it really goes. So on the negative side, we've had people say something like, oh, my strength is this specific aspect of building web applications, and that's something that we need. So we're like, great, we'll assess it. And that was one of like the 3 strengths that they mentioned, and we assessed like 2 or all 3 of them, I forget. And after we came out the other end of assessing that thing, we didn't think they did an especially great job on that thing. So it highlights, like, if they think that's one of their top strengths and we assessed it as to not be super great, it highlights that maybe they're not going to be a great fit on our team because that just didn't work out. And there are some recovery cases, like if we think someone didn't do super great on a module, we tell them, we ask them how they felt about it. We ask them if they want to do something else to try and represent that strength. So there's some ways to recover from that case. But even so, it gives us more confidence in declining people that apply when they say, like, this is my strength, and then that doesn't get demonstrated super well to us. On the positive side, it's usually someone has like a more unique strength that maybe you didn't think of, that after you assess, realize that it is one of their strengths and realize that is something you could use. And that can be all kinds of things. It's usually not like the more common skills. Like my examples aren't going to be about software, but so someone might say something like they're really good at researching a new idea and communicating it. And so we can test for that, because sometimes you need to do that as a software engineer. Some people think you need to do it all the time. And so we just structured a new module around, like, how would we even assess this? What does that look like? What makes sense to do in like an hour or so? And it was great. They did dive into something that they never touched before, and were able to explain it to us in a way that we thought was reasonable. And it seemed like an effective skill to have on the team. And it was awesome. So there are things like that really come through.
I like this idea of personalizing the interviews and giving the individuals a chance to, shine, like you said, to show off something that's great about me. But I'm wondering about the scalability of this type of technique. Mm-hmm. When this personalization, right? It's very one-on-one, and even having to create new tests or new modules or new, how would you suggest applying this or something similar when you really do have to get through candidates? Or if you're looking at such a wide variety of, let's say, openings, how do you identify the proper recruiter or the proper person to even make this type of strength finding interview a possibility? Because you, of course, would have to have some knowledge of that strength in order to properly assess it, correct?
Yeah, scaling is definitely an important aspect of this. We tried to find a balance between being flexible to the individual candidate and being consistent across candidates, because for any given strength, you also want to make sure you're assessing it the same way. You want to make sure that someone who comes in and says that they're good at API design gets assessed the same way as the next person that says that and the next person that says that, so that you are reducing some of the bias in your hiring system. So what we ended up doing was we typically have a couple of modules that we do assess everybody on. Like, it's a core skill of this position. You need to know this specific thing. Maybe it will be a little bit more flexible in exactly how they demonstrate it, but the skill itself still needs to be represented. So we aren't making new modules all the time for those. And then there's usually an array of just other modules we prepared just over time. You sort of build these up over time. And a lot of interviews become, oh, we're just going to pick these 4 modules out of our bank of 11 because that fits the overlaps that they have. And I do think this is harder to scale up to like a super high volume for sure. And maybe even at that level, and after over time, you've built up enough modules, like you just don't build any more new modules, but now you have 20 to pick from. So you're just picking the 4 most relevant out of the 20 that you have or something like that. So even when we're in hiring, and we're hiring a lot, we didn't spend a ton of time like making new modules. So even when you interview under the traditional structure, like you still have to build that interview. Somebody has to do it. And this is only different than that in that you might end up building a bit more. Like instead of these are the 4 modules everyone's going to go through, now you have these are the 6 I think we should build ahead of time, and someone came on and I needed to build the 7th for them or whatever. So it is a little bit more work in that way, but I don't think the scaling's quite as bad as it might initially seem. And after running it a bunch, we haven't found that to be the place, at least at the scales where we're hiring, even hiring like multiple people at the same time.
So let's talk about the results and your experience of utilizing and implementing strength finding interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen a difference between, the then to the now versus the pre in the quality of your candidates and your teammates, longevity, tenure, all of that? Is there a tangible difference for you?
Yes, I do want to be a little careful. Like, I've been doing interviews just for a long time, and over time, I'm sure I'm getting better at it in general. And if I'm using this approach more recently, some of that's going to be tied into just getting better interviews in general. But yeah, I have been keeping metrics on this format at least, and over 2 different companies, 94 phone screens, 27 interviews, 14 offers, and 9 hires from this process so far. We've had great success. Every time we've said no to someone, we were really confident that they just wouldn't be a good fit on our team. Not that they wouldn't be a good fit elsewhere, but based on their strengths and our needs. And then all the people that we've hired, except for like 1, but it was more like a special circumstance, have just turned out to be great. And we've been really happy with that approach. We've also had about half of all of the candidates that came through that at least made it to the phone screen part of the process gave us unsolicited positive feedback about the process, which I never really experienced when I was doing any other type of interview process. They would just go out of their way to say that they really enjoyed our process. Even people that we declined and said we weren't going to make them an offer, they would still write back and say, yeah, I understand. By the way, I really liked the process. I think it was a really effective way of highlighting me my best. And it just seemed like I'm not a good fit for what you need right now. Yeah, it seems good.
Wow. So we're coming up on time, and here's what I've heard so far. And guys, chime in if I miss something. But what I've heard is work with the candidate to customize the, or at least get agreement on the flow of how the interview is going to happen, so that there's buy-in and there's an approach that works for everyone. 2, have a candidate actually tell you what they think are their strongest skills or strengths as it relates to what you're looking for, and then of course test those so that it validates or invalidates their own perception. And what else? Those are the key things that I've heard so far, which are phenomenal tips, by the way, for anybody watching this, that could be implemented fairly easily, I would think. What else would you recommend as we wrap up in terms of thinking this, ways to do strength finding with candidates?
I think there are other ways to be flexible. Like, we're also flexible in time. We typically, like, the default case is we try to book like a 4-hour block of time somewhere for the main chunk of the interview. But not everyone can do that. So we have split it up into 2-hour chunks for people before, or each individual session spread out into different places, or during like non-traditional work hours if necessary. So that's helpful. But there's also, like you said before, that some people don't do well with like a whiteboarding example or a take-home test or whatever it is. So being flexible there is also important. We have an optional take-home test where people can work on that beforehand if they feel like in the moment under pressure they're not going to perform well. And several people took us up on that option and did the homework assignment. And then one of that module during the actual interview becomes, let's review your homework assignment and talk about it. We do try to make sure there's at least some collaborative element in the actual interview. Collaboration is a really important part of our team. So we want to make sure we at least get some sense of that, even if they don't feel super comfortable doing that in like a high pressure situation. But we try to navigate that and be really open with them and see what makes sense to them too.
Well, sounds great. We'll definitely recap those on the Monday recap show. Those are good points. For those who haven't caught the whole show today, Monday at 1 p.m. We'll recap over a 10-minute period this entire show. So join us every Mondays at 1 p.m. Pacific. Carlos, who's coming up? What's next? And thank you for joining us, Sean. Really appreciated talking with you today. And those are some great highlights that we will definitely make a point to repeat on Monday.
Well, Tulio, actually, as you know, we have our next Dojo Live guest tomorrow, by the way. And we're going to be speaking with Alex Eisman about AI and software for exploring the limits, which is kind of, it's very, I mean, I look forward to this because, you know, we're going to be talking about whether AI and software help to cure extremely challenging health problems. In this case, well, Alex mentioned cancer, but who knows? You know, we might even extend it to what's going on right now. We don't know. So I look forward to that conversation tomorrow, same time. It's kind of a unusual scheduled conversation because we normally do it on Wednesdays, but it's like a special edition. Tomorrow, same time, right here, 1 p.m. Pacific on Dojo Live. Alex Eisman, CEO and founder of Genium, a premium software engineering and agile consulting firm with offices in Silicon Valley and Argentina. That's what we have tomorrow, Tulio.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you so much, our guest, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Bye, team.